Okay, so today we are looking at the financial crisis of France in the late 1700s that led to a political crisis, which arguably led to a revolution. So to understand what that's all about, I'm going to walk you through some of these slides. You also might want to look at your textbook. We're around page 29, and so I'm going to walk you through this as quickly as I can, and then of course you've got the supporting sheet to answer some of those questions to guide your thinking. So first thing we need to know is the general state of France around this time. The common man believed that France financially was in a bit of trouble, but tended to blame it on the king and the queen because they lived outlandish lifestyles, big parties, big hair, big dresses, you know, all that kind of stuff, lots and lots of gold. And this idea was made worse by certain nobles that used to party with the king and queen that for some reason or another ran out of money or were no longer cool to the king and queen, so they got kicked out of the parties, so they got a bit jealous, a bit bitter, and they would start to spread rumours about how much money that the king and queen were wasting. In reality though, France had fought 4 wars in about 50-something years, and they hadn't won a lot of them, and unfortunately wars cost money. You have to feed all the soldiers, you have to clothe them, you have to buy all their weapons, and it had cost the French government over 400 million livres, which is a lot of cash. And as I said, they didn't win a lot. In the last war they had, which was the 7 Years' War, they got beaten by the British, and that left a lot of French people pretty annoyed at the British. So one thing we need to understand here is that after their wars that they'd lost, they then found themselves in a position where Britain, who was their old enemy, was now fighting, trying to keep a revolution down against the American colonialists who had started to grow there since they'd moved over there. And the French saw this as an opportunity to basically get one back at their old enemy. So they figured if they could support the Americans in the uprising against the British, of course it would be good PR for them, but more importantly, it would be a bit of a stab to the old enemy. So, what do you do when you're in that much debt? Well, there was a man called Turgot. He was the what we call the Comptroller General, or the head finance minister. He realised that they had financial problems in France. Wasn't really sure what to do with them at the time, but thought maybe the best thing to do was more taxes were coming to the government and try and stop the government spending so much money. He foresaw that if the French went in to help the Americans, then that would cost the French more money than they had. So he has that quote there that you can see on your screen, that he famously said to the king that the first shot will send the state into bankruptcy. After this lovely warning that he gave the king, not too long after, Turgot was sacked. So who replaced him? Well, he was replaced by Jacques Necker. Yeah, Jacques Necker also realised that the country was in grave financial danger, but he was a bit clever. He realised that most people, and by most people I mean the people in the first and second estates, didn't want greater austerity. Austerity means tighten up, don't spend so much. He realised that that wasn't going to be the best way to win the hearts and minds of the people. So he also wanted to introduce some tax reforms. The problem was that the French had been borrowing a lot of money, and people were starting to say, well, where's all the money gone? What's going on? And the first person they blame is the Comptroller General, or the finance minister. So what he did was he decided to do something that had never been done before, and he published what was called the Compte Rendu au roi, which was basically the financial summary to the king. So he put out this big, huge document. It's like a book. It was published in lots of different languages, and it sold really well. It was like a bestseller. And it was basically like a listings of how well the French were doing with their finances. And fantastically enough, even though they had spent lots of money on wars, and they had lots of loans, and they didn't have much money coming in, they somehow, according to Necker, had come out with 10 million livre in front. So they were doing quite well. Now, one of the interesting things about Necker is that he was a banker. Okay, so that's why he became head finance minister, because there was lots of things about him that would have usually not been common in a French finance minister. For starters, he was Swiss. Secondly, he was not of noble birth. And thirdly, he was a Protestant, so not a Catholic. So basically, he was in the super minority, but because he was such a good banker, he was so good with money, he ended up being able to create this Compte Rendu and make it appear that France was doing really well economically. So the issue was, in his genius, that he had neglected to report where the interest payments for the loans were coming from and where they were going to. So basically, France owed a lot of money, and Necker was able to hide all that money that they owed in different parts of the Compte Rendu, so it didn't look like they owed that much money. So once again, very clever banking, very clever bookkeeping. In fact, in that time, he not only didn't come out with 10 million livre in front, he'd actually borrowed 520 million livre to pay for the new war of independence in America. So this was some really clever accounting, but it had its reasons. Some of the things that he did do that were positive was he did restructure some taxes. He pushed for a central accounting system to make sure that everybody was working using the same way of recording the money in and the money out, as well as the amount of grain and those kinds of things, because as you should know by now, France was made up of little provinces rather than one whole unified country. Also, he took audit of all the venal offices. We've been talking about these. That's what certain nobility would buy, a venal office. It was quite lucrative because a lot of the taxes and stuff came in there. And he decided that he could fill that with basically accountants, or what they called salaried officials. And this would ensure that the taxes went to the crown. So rather than the nobles or having control of them, taking the taxes in, probably keeping some for themselves, and then handing it on, he would make sure that the people that worked for the king would work in these offices and take the money for the king. Interestingly enough, not too long after Compte Rendu was released, he was stood down. After a couple of years, there was another man called Calonne who came in and took over the job as Comptroller General. And again, by the time he got stuck into the job, a couple of years in, he realised that France was facing bankruptcy. And that's really, really bad. You don't want to be a bankrupt country because no one trades with you, no one deals with you, and it's a real struggle. So what happened is that he inherited debt of about 112 million livres from wars and lavish spending from the royal family. The lavish spending of the royal family bred a bit of contempt for the royal family. A lot of the common people didn't like that idea. And also he had to deal with the corruption that came with this really weird tax system. Finally, the underlying problem that he had to deal with the most when he was Comptroller General was the system of privilege. It's too hard to try and gather money when a third of your country doesn't have to pay taxes, and the 2/3 that do don't have much money. So Calonne realised that he had to reform this system because his country was going to run out of money, which is not a good thing. So what did he do? Well, he took an interesting approach to this, and he was a real reformist, Calonne. And what he thought was he tried to eliminate all the little taxes, which was usually paid by the third estate. So your taxes for grain, your taxes for trade, your taxes for land, all these kinds of little taxes. He tried to get rid of all of those, and he wanted to replace that with what he called the territorial subvention, which is basically a landowner's tax. So what he did, in essence, was he took the taxes away from the third estate and spread them across all three estates. But more importantly, realistically, if we're looking at a landowner's tax, who owns all the land? Most of the people in the first two estates. So this was a big shift. This was one of the first real ideas where he thought we need to tax the people that have more because they've got more and they can afford to pay a little bit more. Not always going to be a popular move, but this was his plan anyway. Basically, as well as that, to promote trade and economic stimulus, he proposed to abolish internal taxes and external tariffs on. So if you bought and sold, the taxes of those came right down, which means that even if you're a landowner, you could still get your taxes, your grain from your peasants, and you could go sell that and you wouldn't get taxed as much anymore. Okay? So that was really important because that gets people buying things and selling things. And the more people buy and sell, the healthier the economy is. He also thought that if the tax, the territorial subvention, which would now be put towards the nobility, if he could soften the blow for that by allowing the people in the third estate to make more stuff. If they made more stuff, then it was easier for the landowners to pay their tax. Okay? So basically, he came up with the idea of removing the corvée. Now, we haven't talked a lot about the corvée, but the corvée was enforced labour. So basically, if you were in the third estate and they needed roads built in your area, they would take you out of the fields and you would have to work for the king and you would have to build the roads. Okay? That's how they were able to build roads so very well throughout France. Calonne proposed that we get rid of the corvée completely, okay, and they just pay a tax instead. So you don't have to build the roads, okay, but you still have to pay the government so they can build the roads. I thought that was a bit fairer because the idea is if you pay the tax, you can still spend all day in the field buying your grain or building your grain and harvesting your grain. Then you can give the grain that you need to your lord so he can pay his land tax, and you can also use the grain to pay your roads tax. Okay? To make all that happen though, that still would take time for that to bring money in, about 35 million livres, he thought. But in the short term, once again, just like his predecessors, he had to borrow more money. And that's what he tried to do. But to borrow more money, you have to have some sort of insurance, I suppose. So bankers don't just dish out money. So bankers and rich investors from other countries, places like Amsterdam and stuff like that, that were doing quite well with their trade, they're only going to loan money to France if France could assure them that the money would get paid back. So remember you had the Compte Rendu, which said, hey, we're not doing that badly, okay, which was good. That helped money come into France because people were willing to loan them money. Afterwards, though, people thought maybe they don't have enough money. So Calonne's reforms that he wanted to put in place were going to give more money to France, which means they could pay their bills. So in order for France to get a loan, they had to show that they were a good investment. Now, to be a good investment, they had to show that they were going to reform their tax system. So how does he do that? Well, not everyone was against tax reforms. Even in the nobility, they thought that tax reforms could be a good idea. But if you're going to invest, those tax reforms can't be ideas, they have to be laws. Okay? The issue was that parliaments, or the high law courts, because they were the hardest hit, they're not necessarily going to want to go for this. And they're lawmakers. So they're like, why would we bring in a law that's going to make our life crappy? So what happened was Calonne had to go and ask the king for a different lawmaking body. And that lawmaking body was the Assembly of Notables. The Assembly of Notables hadn't really been put into place or hadn't been called by the king since the early 1600s. We're now in 1787 and all of a sudden he wants to bring, well, Calonne wants the king to bring these notables into place. These notables, or these nobles more specifically, because most of them are nobles, can make good decisions. Once they make a binding decision, then it goes to the parliaments, or they make a recommendation to the king. And the king puts out his law, and then the parliaments say, yeah, that's a good law, or that's a bad law. But usually, if it's come from the Assembly of Notables, they'll say it's a good law. So what Calonne's deal was, he was like, okay, if I can get the king to pick certain nobles that I know are happy to deal with tax reform, then I can get them to recommend this to the king, then the king will recommend it to the parliaments, then the parliaments will pass it into law. Once it's in law, then we can get more cash from outside so our economy can run again, as well as just being better monetarily. So the Assembly of Notables, it was made up of princes and bishops and mayors and magistrates and all sorts of people of nobility. And Calonne believed that if he could persuade those nobles that his forms were best for the country, then they would persuade the parliaments and it would pass into law and France would recover. Most of the notables, interestingly enough, believed in the reform in theory. They liked it. And what was important is that these people were very influential. But it didn't go all according to plan. We're going to find out about that next lesson. From this lesson, okay, from this little video, I want you to go through questions 1 to 6. Okay, you should be able to get the answers out of that. I also then want you to use your textbooks. On page 35, there is a little grey box that's called Historian's Views. I want you to read that, and that should help you with question 7 and question 8. On Tuesday, when I see you, we're going to go through questions 1 to 8. Okay? If you have any questions before then, please email me, and we'll see how this all goes. So by Tuesday, questions 1 to 8 done, and use your textbook on page 35 to help you with questions 7 and 8. All right? Thanks. See ya.